Welcome to another episode of Stutter with Confidence. Mike Wilson here, the host, as always, and happy today to have Dr. Rod Gabel. Rod, if you would, first of all, welcome, and for those that don't know you, if you tell people where you live, where you're from originally, and what you do.
And sorry, Mike, I just have to make a note about my name. It's Rod Gabel. It's a very odd spelling. So just to reduce confusion for those who are familiar with me, I'm a person who stutters. I live in Vestal, New York. I've been here for about now 2 years. I am the founding director of the speech language pathology program at Binghamton University, and I'm a professor. I am also a speech language pathologist as well, and have developed and run a few different kinds of intensive stuttering therapy programs, but also just stuttering clinics in general over my career.
Good stuff. So where'd you get your PhD from? Was it one of the Ohio schools? I knew you're in Ohio for a long time, right?
Yeah. I lived in Ohio really like most of my life. I earned my undergraduate and master's degree at Bowling Green State University, and then I earned my doctorate at Penn State University, and I finished that up in 1999. And then to take it a step further, I've worked at a few other universities. I was at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point as an assistant professor, and then I was an assistant and associate at Bowling Green State University, was able to go back to my alma mater, and then I earned my full professor title during my time at the University of Toledo, which was where I was most recently before coming to the southern tier of New York.
And so that's where you have started the program at Binghamton University, which, I lived in Binghamton for 6 years and now live an hour north in Syracuse. And I know, or my understanding is of the SUNY schools of the State of the University of New York schools, Binghamton's is widely thought of it, as the top, sort of the flagship academically, at least. I'm sure some other schools might argue with that, but from what I've heard, that's the case.
Yeah.
That's a real honor to be able to do that. And so I wasn't planning on talking too much about this, but sort of in a concise way, like what are what's sort of an interesting aspect or a challenging aspect of starting a new program at a school?
Well, first off, I can't say enough about the efficiencies within the State University of New York system. I know some of my colleagues would probably agree, would probably disagree and see a lot of bureaucracy, but I just feel like there's a real feeling of wanting to go forward and wanting to improve and to have the university make people's lives better. And I think that feeling really is energizing. The challenges, well, first off, besides a really great building, there was no infrastructure at all when I came in. We had nothing. And I was the only speech language pathologist on the whole campus. And, it was interesting after years of feeling constantly swimming upstream to try to do new things and to change things. It's really hard to do within a university context. But then to come here, it was both super positive that there was really nothing, because then I could sort of find, logical and important ways to sort of build things out. But then also, it's hard because being the only person working on this endeavor for the first at least 18 months was really challenging, because it's okay, well, I've got to do it and I've got to make people understand. So, those things were challenging and continue to be, but it's also sort of the fun of the job. But since last summer, I've hired 8 faculty. And so 6, well, there's, yeah, no, actually 9 faculty. And so 2 will be joining us in September, but the rest of the team has been on campus for the last 6 months. And that's been nice because now starting to see things sort of build out with our clinical service plan, but also with our undergrad program. So it's been kind of nice to have people around. So, but that working in isolation was sort of tough. And then also just having to explain and do things pretty much step by step with a pretty scant foundation in place.
I'm sure it's nice to, to have a team that's building around you. You can get a lot more done with, 6 people than you can with 1, obviously.
Yeah,
That's good stuff.
it's for sure. Yeah, it's for sure.
So diving into your stuttering story, and I always really enjoy these conversations with folks who both stutter themselves. So you've got the sort of, lifelong experience and having studied what it's like to be a person who stutters from inside, from being yourself. And then PhD and all the education and experience, studying, stuttering. I always want to confuse those 2 words in my pronunciation.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
But a ton of experience on basically all sides of this. And so for people that are not familiar, because I know you've done a lot of research in stuttering, published research, what has been, sort of the general focus or the things that has interested you the most about stuttering over the years?
Okay, so my research, I think, has been sort of on 2 fronts. The first front is really just sort of the psychosocial impact of stuttering and also just the personal, within that sort of the personal experience of stuttering. And so early on, I did a lot of survey research that explored sort of the stereotype and stigma of stuttering, but then also a concept called role entrapment, which is this idea of, and I looked at role entrapment from the standpoint of employment issues. And so, variety of, people who don't stutter, their perceptions of appropriate career choices for people who stutter as a measure of stereotype and role entrapment. So that was kind of where I spent a lot of my time. And then over the past, I would say 10 years, that line of research sort of took a turn, and I've done a good bit of research on personal narratives of stuttering, be it either through a kind of a qualitative approach, looking at personal interviews of different aspects of experience, but then also trying to look at existing texts and speeches and those kinds of things done by people who stutter and what those can tell us about the experience of stuttering. And then my other line of research has been really more clinically focused. I published a good number of outcome studies, be it either case studies or small group studies, looking at the outcomes of some of my clinical programs, the intensive programs, and I really got involved in teletherapy pretty early on as well, just because of a lot of the folks who needed my help, weren't within a reasonable driving distance to get therapy. So I started doing a lot of teletherapy as early as 2008. Then, so that's really been a lot of my research over the last 10 years has been the clinical research, and then also looking at different aspects of clinical, well, suppose you could call them clinical approaches, things like disclosing stuttering and what are the benefits and kind of things like that, like looking at those kinds of skills. And that's really an area I'd like to do a lot more research on, is the disclosure, but then certain specific helping techniques or things that people do from speech therapy or really from other kinds of aspects of their life to help themselves with stuttering.
It's like what kind of things, improve people's lives essentially
Yeah,
that stutter.
yeah, and have a interesting study I'm doing right now with another faculty member here who also happens to be doing his doctoral studies with me. He's really interested in this idea, and it's essentially the question is, what other things do you do besides speech therapy that have helped you with your stuttering? Because, there has been some discussion, I think, and of course, a lot of times, like people go to support groups or groups similar to what you do as well, Mike, but also just this idea of what other kinds of, health and wellness related activities or like personal changes do you do? I mean, to deal with stuttering. And that research sort of came from the fact that a lot of folks who have attended our clinics over the years really could tell us other things they do to help themselves. Like the one guy said, he goes, honestly, he said, I play football. He goes, and I find that really helps because no one's going to give me a hard time because I'm the starting middle linebacker on the football team. And quite honestly, that helps as much as what I'm doing with you, Dr. Gabel. He said, because no one's going to give me a hard time. And I thought that was really interesting. It's he saw, not only did he just love to play the game, but he said, he goes, no one's going to bully me like they did when I was younger. He said, it's just not going to happen. And, I always thought that was interesting, but I think you can take it to more reasonable or perhaps potentially reasonable things like, yoga, eating a good diet, getting enough sleep. I mean, kind of looking at these things from a standpoint of, there can sometimes be things besides speech therapy that can really help people. And that perhaps we really haven't considered much.
Good stuff. And it definitely comes up in support groups, because it's just sort of everybody's freewheeling, sharing their thoughts. And, some of it has the feeling of sort of grasping at straws sometimes. Well, when I eat macaroni and cheese, the next day I seem to be a little more fluent, and as we all know, those of us who stutter at least, confidence can play, can have an influence. So if you think, and even in a purely physical sense, the medical community, I think is pretty well established that the placebo effect, if you think your knee hurts, or if your knee does hurt and you think this pill is going to help your knee pain, there's some positive effect apparently that they've identified. And stuttering, obviously, when we believe that things are going to be better, things sometimes are, but a lot of it, the ideas obviously that come up seem pretty random. Well, when I wear purple socks, it seems to help.
Yeah.
Okay, that sort of thing. But something like you were talking about the psychosocial side of things that you've spent a lot of time thinking about and working on and all that. And, it's there in the word, right? There's psychological there, and how these social interactions are with the world. Well, when you're the starting middle linebacker, that engenders a certain amount of respect. You're very competent at that, or you wouldn't be in that position. You're one of the best players on the defense. And so are there certain things that come up most commonly? Like the sports one is one that I've heard from several people where they, and this was my case, where I was terrified to speak in high school and was trying to hide my stutter at all costs. But I had my internal sense of self-worth was, while it was being dragged down by the fact that I knew I was that I was a shadow of who I would be if I was, speaking and saying what I wanted to say in life. But at the same time, it was sort of buoyed a little bit because I was a decent athlete in basketball, and that sense of like, I know I'm not a total loser at everything, that sort of feeling at that stage. You say it's a part of it, that when people have positive things in their life, it tends to buoy up their spirit and their, sort of resilience for going through life with a stutter, which is
Yeah,
really
yeah,
challenging.
yeah. Like I think that's really what we would like to explore in this study, or at least start to explore. It's like, okay, so you say you do this and this helps stuttering. Tell me about that, because I don't think we really know. I mean, we can speak from personal experience, and I shared the story about the kid who was linebackers sort of as the example of like, okay, I get that, but that's not really helping your stuttering, right? And as I explored that more with him, because as I was really curious, he said, well, no, he goes, I'm still having a pretty bad time with my speech, and I still don't want to speak in class, but in this very like micro way, in his own words, he said, I feel better because I got this and I really enjoy it. And it gives me, I mean, he didn't say status, but this idea of like, I sort of have a role, and I like have this respect. But the only way it's really helped when he really sort of narrowed down, he said, he goes, it's not about my speech and about my ability to communicate. I'm still really scared and I feel pretty bad about this, but you know what? No one's going to say a word to me about it. And to him, that was, at least I've got that taken care of, because he was really having a hard time. And like he made a good bit of progress, and, like made some really nice changes that he couldn't attribute to being a like athlete or things outside of what was stuttering. But I think that there was a lot gained by that for him in that kind of tough period of time, like you were describing with your high school experience, this idea of like, it's good to have those positive things, or those things you like to do, or those things that like help you. I think what we're going to really, what we're really curious about with this new line of research is like, what are things that then we can attribute back to, be it, a more like health and wellness model of kind of like techniques, like I said, things like yoga, exercise, a more like healthy lifestyle, and do people attribute those to helping stuttering? Because I think there's all kinds of things you have to be really careful of, because I know there's a lot of along like history of like, what, when I, like tap my hand, I do a lot better with my speech. Well, that's great, but you create a whole nother level of problems, right? Because there's a dependence, there is a placebo maybe kind of thing that really quits working, but then it becomes sort of this behavior that continues to go and go, the whole concept of a like secondary or reactive behavior. So it's not really that we're interested in, it's more, what are we looking at that can be attributed to a like healthier way of like living with stuttering, and not just kind of a machine gun approach of these like list of things that people tell us that they like to do. Because again, sometimes it's not, there's going to be really good past research evidence that says, what, this is really something you ought to not do. So kind of teasing that out and looking for new areas of, kind of discovery and like understanding of things maybe we haven't thought about. I know with our preliminary data, we're finding that focus groups and being around other people who stutter is a major thing. And then the other area is really this idea of disclosure and talking about stuttering.
So that, and probably both of those things are sort of working, or they could work synergistically, right?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Because on the one hand, you're, practicing basically a new lifestyle of not hiding, right?
Mhm.
Telling people, sort of proclaim it from the rooftops, as I like to think about the goal mentality there. At least it's been super useful for me and a lot of people. We all know how painful it can be to just go through every second of your life, every day. How, God, how can I hide it? How can I not stutter here? that trying to fool the world essentially that
Yeah.
we're, quote, normal fluent speakers, which means not saying a lot of things we want to say, changing words, just, avoiding situations, et cetera, which is a miserable. I've never met anybody that's happy living like that, right? I mean, I've met people who are sort of, to borrow the phrase from Pink Floyd, sort of comfortably numb a little bit in that existence, where certainly getting out of that comfort zone and openly stuttering, risking stuttering it's something that feels like, you might as well, eject them into outer space without a spacesuit or something. But so there's that. Practicing radical honesty, as I would call it, disclosures, right? And, and maybe even some voluntary stuttering, showing you're stuttering on purpose, or just charging into moments when you're going to stutter. So you're about to show people your stutter, that sort of thing. But then on the spending time with other folks who stutter, that's also, a very honest sort of act, because we're acknowledging, going to a support group for people that stutter because I am, right? Because I think a lot of us know we stutter, but the temptation to think, no, I'm not really a person that stutters. Like tomorrow, maybe I'll wake up and it'll all be gone, sort of thing, which is an understandable, certainly dream. And it's an understandable thing for us to even believe, because we all know it's sometimes I can do it without a problem. I know I can do it. I think it's possible, that sort of feeling,
Yeah. Well, the thing, like I've been thinking a lot about recently, and just kind of, what seems to actually work. And like a lot of this comes from research, and then also my clinical work, is like, what do we do as people who stutter, or as people who are tasked or choosing to help people who stutter and try to understand stuttering? It's sort of this concept of like empowerment. If things you do are empowering you, with your stuttering. And I think if it's just this concept of empowerment, if what you're doing is empowering you, I bet you anything it's going to be helpful. And I think avoiding, it's not the opposite of empowerment, but avoiding would seem to be when you're looking at something like communicating and connecting with people, stuff that we need to do. Avoiding is probably not going to be very empowering. I think that stands to reason. Disclosing, being honest, not fighting against your speech, not trying to hide it, and like hide your stuttering, is probably going to be a lot more empowering. And then I wonder what other things are empowering. For example, I know when I was a kid, this would have been late high school, I'm not even sure how I got it. I would bet it was my mom went to the library and saw it on the shelf and was trying to quietly help me without being pushy. She brought home a book called Stutter No More by Martin Schwartz. And it was basically a book that said you could cure your own stuttering by doing these 9 different techniques, right? And all of it came down to things like breathing, which I think after all these years, we have to be kind of careful about breathing as the component of change, right? So, but man, I got really good at talking the way like Martin Schwartz said. And I read that book and I was diligent. I approached it like the athlete I was. I did the practice, I did all of it. And that lasted about a week. And then when that week was over, I was stuttering just as bad and as hard as I ever did. And I was guilty. I felt very guilty about, oh God, I didn't do this well, or I didn't help this well. If I could just move to Brooklyn and meet Martin Schwartz, or Manhattan, wherever the like heck he lived. And I think what had happened though was that wasn't very empowering, because it wasn't how I talked. It didn't account for all the other things that often go on, especially the idea that, you can do all those great techniques and still stutter. And then what do you do if you don't have skills to bounce back? And so I think that that's an example of, I think, some procedures that probably are similar to speech therapy at that time, which is a very fluency-based approach, can sometimes not be empowering if the person doesn't feel it's empowering. And so there has to be a real sense of matching of what is the person's goals, thoughts, beliefs, and match to what are some things that they can do to empower. Because I think empowerment's everything, like that's why I think sometimes speech activities maybe aren't the answer for a lot of us who stutter.
And when you say empowering, well, because as we all know, the code hasn't been cracked, right? Martin Schwartz or anybody else in human history hasn't cracked the stuttering code, at least able to spread it to everybody else that stutters, right? You have this, I don't know what it is, 1 in 500, 1 in 1,000, whatever the numbers are, occasional folks who largely, seem to quote overcome their stutter, but we don't know how to teach it to everybody, right? Or even the vast majority. And certainly the approach of, well, you just have to do this, just do this, and you will overcome it, right? We're like, oh, okay. And I get how, so if someone were trying to teach us how to be a great golfer, let's say, right? And they have a certain approach. Well, we do need to have confidence in their approach or we're not going to put in the time and effort. So I do understand that, like, just do it and it'll work sort of ethos, right? That certainly is a good thing in sports in general. But it doesn't stick for the vast majority of folks who stutter. So you're left, and I had that same feeling. I went to Hollins for 3 weeks, 3 weeks of 9 hours a day or whatever, working hard on my speech. It was easy onset, amplitude contour, breathing. And of course it worked while I was there, and I'm not just picking on Hollins. This is just about all of these, I think, or pretty much all of them, I think, that we know of in history, right? Nobody just took the technique in mass for everybody that came out of there, or most people that came out of there, and boom, they, conquered their stutter. So, but that feeling when I was coming back from there, like, oh, this is it, this is it. I found it, it's working, and it's gonna work, and go back, and within 4 or 5 days, it had just fully fallen apart. And then you're like, oh, and because you don't know that it's not working for hardly anybody else in the long run either. So you blame yourself. Oh, I'm such a screw up. I'm screwing up in my speech again, and then there's even more of a tendency to just like, okay, I'm just going to shut up because, that sort of thing. But would you say that the empowering people psychosocial, right, where they are living their life and are sort of climbing that ladder of courage, as I like to call it, where they're willing to speak up and stutter, but they're saying what they want. So socially, they're now, or at least increasingly sort of developing it more where they're actually saying what they want in this life, like people who don't stutter, usually say what they want, I think. Would you say empowering psychosocially is the big?
Yeah, like that's certainly been my experience. And I think our research in the field is playing that out where, when you really look at it, when you are focusing on, well, let's get the person fluent and all their emotional mindset will follow along, which I think for a very long time, especially when I was new to the field, that was a prevailing thought. And I mean, not a large number of speech language pathologists, but I think a very loud minority. And I think that that's really not where most speech language pathologists who really know what they're doing are at. I think a lot of us who are specialists by certification or just by practice would probably say that empowering people psychosocially on, their self-worth, their ability to live effectively with their stuttering is really where you should put most of your efforts. That seems to be the most helpful. And there is a variety of different ways to do that. But that's probably most helpful. Personally, what I see is that I get people that I work with who and most of my clients I'm able to keep in touch with as long as they want to. They really become much more fluent, if we're even worried about that, but I think we have to be to an extent. So I'll just say it, that idea of being able to talk smoothly in a way that is relatively free of stuttering, that's a long way to say what we think about as fluent. They really get there by just talking more and being maybe less nervous, less inhibited, less worried, more empowered, making some of the, using disclosure, and then just overcoming their fears. They tend to actually get a really, what they would say, a very acceptable level of stuttering and fluency then. But if we spend lots of time working on fluency, what tends to happen is you only want to talk when you're able to do that. And then if it doesn't work, you wonder why it didn't work. And it's kind of like, why go about that then? Why not work on trying to achieve what you want to achieve, speak when you want to speak, be able to learn how to have the stuttering not impact your entire message, and being able to handle yourself in a way that you feel good about. Why not make that the goal? Because if you can attain that, you can attain a lot of happiness, a lot of success in your life, and also just start to feel better about talking, maybe want to do it more. And then all of a sudden, maybe you're in the big picture doing a lot better, even though there's still lots of, micro times where it's still pretty challenging, but overall, perhaps your approach is better. And again, I think there probably are some very specific kinds of things that we do across different approaches to helping people that get you there.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And it's the analogy that I really like for this, is going back. As I can tell, the best analogy in the history of stuttering is the stuttering iceberg, that she had
Sure.
together, right? As far as explaining both I won't say necessarily what stuttering is, because that's still an open question as to what, percentage is from genetics and what percentage is from all the things that we do trying not to stutter, et cetera. But it certainly is the best analogy for what stuttering feels like, what the experience is like, right? So if you take a big iceberg, obviously the machine's analogy is the 10 to 20%, the actual stuttering, what you can see, what the speech therapist can see, because that's all you got, unless the person's telling you about everything below the surface, right? And then the 80 to 90%, that below the surface portion, the shame, the embarrassment, the guilt. And I always thought of guilt as an interesting one on that list, right? Because there's a guilt sort of like we're letting ourselves down. There's a guilt that we're letting maybe our parents down, letting our therapist down because the technique's not working outside of the clinic. But also a guilt just that we're wasting people's time. So like when we're stuttering, we're like, oh, everybody has to stop and wait for me to talk. So I'll just shut up and not say it, so I don't have to put people through that, right? There's a general, just a thick guilt, I think, that runs deep in a lot of us. Sense of inferiority, all that kind of stuff. So thinking about how to approach this, right? Say 90% below, 10% above. Like you said, for decades there, it seems, what became sort of in vogue in the speech therapy stuttering world, at least amongst a lot of folks, was just chop off that 10% above, and then somehow and then the rest of it will just take care of itself. And that'd be great if we could just chop off that 10% above and they could go speak in any situation and control their speech. Okay, I will grant them the point. If you can do that, then yeah, everything else should take care of itself largely. But you can't do that. We can't do that, right? So sticking with that analogy, if you can melt that 80 to 90% below the surface, right, where they're confident, courageous, determined communicators, where they stutter or not, right, that's gone. Well, just like a real iceberg in the ocean, you melt the 80 to 90% that's below the surface. What's above the surface is going to get a lot, potentially weaker and more wobbly, right? Because the foundation is gone. And so my thought, because as we were saying before we started recording, nothing is static in this modern world, right? Everything's changing. So 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, at some point, this stuttering thing, like everything else, is going to, continue to evolve. And my thought or dream or whatever in 2022 is that if we can get better and better and better over time at helping people melt that 80 to 90% below the surface, well, then, maybe we do find a particular approach, technique, whatever, that you can then focus on the 10% above. But like athletes, right? If an athlete is playing scared, they're never going to reach their physical potential. It doesn't matter how many 3-pointers they can make in a row in practice. If they're terrified of missing in front of, 1,000 people watching or whatever, they're never going to be able to make 3-pointers in the game, And it's the same analogy. Let's, work towards this ultimate, goal as a community for those that want to do this. It's not one size fits all, but where we have sort of an army, if you will, of courageous, confident communicators who are not, thinking anymore, oh, what are they going to think if I stutter? They're just like, well, if somebody has a problem with my stutter, I don't know what to tell you, buddy, I got to stutter, that sort of mentality. And then, maybe at some point we, find an approach, a technique, whether it's meditation stuff or timing stuff or cadence, whatever the case may be, but probably just good public speaking 101 sort of stuff, and I threw a lot out there, but what are your thoughts on it?
No, I think that's pretty much it. It's like, right, you almost have to help somebody learn. Well, I think learn's a bad way to think about it. You have to help people figure out what's going to help them feel better and be able to move forward, however they're going to talk. Okay. And there is a good reason why the fluency shaping approaches were helpful, or seen as helpful, or done a lot. It's because they seem to help. I mean, no one did that because they were trying to hurt anybody, right? It was sort of like, this seems to work. We can bring it under control in the lab, so therefore we're going to go forward. And again, I think there's lots of problems with that. I think the biggest problem is that, no one ever did the research on why did it work for somebody and why did it not work for other people. I should say that there was really one good study, I think, that was done in the early 2000s. And I won't cite it because I don't think it's really all that important to your listeners, but they basically found that the reason it didn't work for their group of clients was because they just didn't like doing it. Well, duh. Right. But I wonder for the people, and I would say, given the widespread use of that kind of approach, why it helped them. I would guess that it helped because the people who used it, they really used it a lot. They really felt very comfortable using it, and they probably gained a lot of the improvements you're talking about, the idea of feeling better, being able to move forward, being able to communicate and not worry about anyone else. And I wonder if that hidden part of their iceberg was melted because they felt they had good fluency skills. I don't know, but I think that would be be my thought is that maybe there's a lot of ways to help stuttering that makes sense. There's a whole lot of ways to try to help stuttering that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So let's just take those out of the discussion. But I think there could be a good number of ways to help people. It may not, we may not even have to do the ongoing conversation of what's best, because I think that, from my vantage point, that may not be the most fruitful discussion. But if there's a lot of ways to help stuttering that makes good sense, if there's commonalities, that would help us explain much better. But then we could also kind of understand what people are doing and why, and then be able to draw some conclusions about that, and hopefully be able to make those approaches more accessible to people instead of more exclusive, but also maybe increase the number of folks who do this well, within my profession at least. So like we can get more help and get them the tools.
And speaking of that, you mentioned that you had started doing teletherapy, many years ago, long before it became necessary in COVID. And I think this is a potential, it already is, but this is a big part. This might be the biggest thing that ever happened in the history of stuttering, because suddenly, and I know it's a big statement, but suddenly support groups just are flourishing, right? There's I know of at least 10 new support groups that have popped up since COVID started. I'm sure there's way more than that. And they do regular online Zoom calls, right? Anybody can get there with a 5-second commute on Zoom. And I've been in a lot of in-person support meetings. That's a little better than Zoom, but you're still talking to people and say, it's still basically in-person support, I feel like. And maybe it's even a safer place, right? I've heard of some stories from time to time where you go to a support group and it's 9 guys and 1 girl, and the girl feels a little, and not safe or uncomfortable or whatever. And so it's a totally physically safe way to go to support groups, right? And you can even dip your toe in where you can not have your video on or not have your mic on, and just sort of, look into the room without actually stepping into the room physically, and again, it's so easily accessible. Like, for example, Hawaii and Utah are 2 examples. I know there's more states, but 2 that I've memorized from, did not, I think still do not have chapters of the National Stuttering Association. So you had nowhere to go, right? And now there was Stutter Social, which is a great thing that's out there. But that accessibility for support groups, and then the teletherapy side of it. And I would hope, and this is a question, I've thought of this. So are there insurance barriers to doing group therapy in general? Is that one of the incentives that is holding back? Because I think a group therapy, and I was talking to Vivian Siskin, who does a lot of group therapy, as does AIS, as did Joseph Sheehan, for example. And Van Riper also, when Barry Guitar was on the podcast, he described doing group speech therapy with Van Riper, because Barry's a person that stutters, as was Van Riper. That's then you're combining both the social group, right? Everybody that's sitting in the room gets it. We know we're not alone. We know our feelings, all that below the iceberg stuff is not because we're some sort of, weirdo who is reacting so badly. This is the standard way for most of us to react to stuttering. And humans aren't designed to exist in a tribe of one. It's powerful to have a community, but if there's a good therapy approach that's happening, or peer mentorship or coaching or whatever the venue, as long as it's quality that's happening combined with the group, that to me, and again, it's nothing new. Van Riper, Sheehan, a lot of the legends have done it. But 2 questions. Do you think that's a very useful and efficient way to do this, right? Because you don't have to have one therapist with one person for a whole hour. You got one therapist with 5 people or 8 people or whatever. So from an efficiency standpoint and just from an effectiveness standpoint, but are there insurance limitations as things stand right now?
Yeah, in my experience, and again, and I feel like I've run a private practice through the universities I've been at, but then I did run my own private practice for about a year right before I left Toledo. It takes a lot of work to even get recognized as a like entity for insurance providers to work with. Then from there, I think the level of care that insurance companies will help with for stuttering, and really I think a lot of communication disorders in general can be pretty limited. I think someone like Vivian or some of my other colleagues who have run like larger private practice could certainly speak more intelligently about it, because I honestly, like, it was a side gig and I was too busy and it really never grew. So I just didn't charge people very much. But the other thing you're looking at with stuttering, I think from an insurance standpoint, is that it tends to be a fairly chronic problem. So you're not going to get like you aren't going to be able to have your insurance company say, we'll cover 15 sessions. I mean, that's not probably going to do a lot. It's going to be really hard. People are going to go down to like private pay pretty quickly. And that's really, really hard financially for families. So that's one thing. And I think group therapy falls in there. I'm just not sure how much insurance companies help with that. I think there are some barriers to like telepractice as well because of that. Because again, some insurance companies don't value telepractice. When we went to COVID, I think they're like, well, we have to value it, but I think some of those regulations are starting to melt away where they're not doing that as much. But again, state by state, like region by region with insurance. So I would just say if we're counting on doing things that insurance is going to help with, we might as well forget it, because I think we're going to have very limited positive experiences. I think, again, some people with their practices have really like figured that out and have flourished, and I think that's wonderful. For my money, why I am now all in on the university system is that we can be pretty creative. And I love that about the state of New York, where it's like, I sent in my proposal for what I thought a fee to run a clinic here in our area would look like. And they sent it back and said, you're charging too much, lower your costs, which based on like my experience elsewhere, I about fell out of my chair. So we're going to be able to charge a very low fee. It's going to be like $10 a session for group therapy and about $25 for like individuals. So I think that's the model I'm excited about. Then if you can get donations and grant money, you can knock that down even lower, which would be exciting to me. So that's sort of the funding issue, and how does group therapy fall into that? The like other side is access. And I really think that's why I was very interested in teletherapy, is this idea of like, just as you said, people can reach their services better. And I ran a pretty active program in that for years. And it was mostly made on the view I had as far back as Penn State when I worked in my first intensive program. It's like, man, we work with these people for 2 weeks. They make these great changes. And it was a very non-fluency based approach. They get comfortable, they do all this, but let's face it, they're here for 2 weeks in State College, Pennsylvania, on the great Penn State campus, very like welcoming, very pretty, very nice, good therapists who like them and treat them well. And they've got their group of colleagues who stutter, and they're good therapists supporting them. Guess what? That is not what they're going home to. And when you go home from a clinic like that, your mindset is caught in limbo. It's like, well, I know all this stuff and I had this great 2 weeks and it was wonderful and I know what to do, but you know what? I've lived in this other environment for a very long time and it's not as friendly and people don't understand. So how does that work? So, like I had a great doctoral student at the time, Farzana Rani, who is now at Texas State University and has been for a long time. And I was reading a lot about telepractice, and I was like, just brought in my group of doctoral students, and I said, does anyone do a lot of this? Because again, being kind of like technologically, I suppose I'd say technologically disinterested. At the time, I knew this stuff was going on, but I was just like, yeah, whatever. I don't have time to learn about this. I said, has anyone done this? And Farzan's like, that's the only way I talk to my family, because his mom and dad were in Mumbai, India. So he's like, I do it every night. I talk to my folks at midnight so I can actually talk to them. And so we just started testing it, and the outcomes for our patients were so much better, because when they went home, they could check back in with us. And it was mostly individual, but they could, call it practice, call it just having a home base to help them be able to navigate the changes was really good. And so that's when I got into it. Back then, lots of people were like, this is insane. This is crazy. It's not real therapy, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, of course it is. It's just a different mode of delivery. And now I think that's like where the profession is. So I think telepractice is a great way. And I think it's been nice for me to have about a year and a half of not doing very much therapy and just kind of thinking and reviewing data. I think group is maybe the real way to go. From an economy standpoint, but also from a way to get people both the support, but also the information, because I think a lot of stuttering therapy is, learning about stuttering and becoming more aware of stuttering. I think having folks to bounce ideas off of, to listen to each other, to get a good delivery of information, I think that's really the way to go. And I think given the limited number of groups or experts out there in speech language pathology who can work with people who stutter, teletherapy and doing it in groups is really going to be important for us to be as efficient as possible. I think individual therapy is great, but I do think there are limitations, and you can always default to people getting extra individual sessions. But, I do think group might be, and it'll be kind of new for me when I started up, because I think I've usually delivered it as group being the supplement, but I think maybe that's something I had wrong, and maybe I can benefit from doing more group therapy going forward. I think I answered your question, but that was a long narrative there. I apologize.
No, that was good stuff. And yeah, sticking with that, I think again that the psychosocial aspect of it, which is, as we said earlier, probably the most important, or the one that we can have the biggest positive change on. And our psychosocial, that's sits at the center of human existence, it seems to me. What's our psychology, and where are we at in the social, from a social sense? Do we feel connected to other people? Right? I think there's enormous evidence on the medical side. People that live longer tend to be more connected with other people, right? People that are healthier, connected with other people, fitter, you name it. They're positive outcomes from not being socially isolated. And stuttering can be incredibly socially isolating. Even if we're around other people, we all know how much we can feel, constantly feel like the only stutterer in the group there, right? Everybody else here can say what they want, and I can't. That's a sort of social prison to live in. But the group effect, yeah, and it's so powerful, and there's so much mentorship that happens, especially in a group, because what we focus on typically, right, when we're, say when you step on I don't know, pick your sport, but I've played more basketball than any other. When you step on the basketball court and you're working on an aspect of your game, so you're consciously trying to take steps forward as a player, that's, for me, much more I improve at a much more rapid rate when I'm out there with the practice mentality, and the experience, just working on things. And I'm not saying fluency per se when it comes to stuttering. That's not the main thing, obviously, that we're talking about here. But just, someone said, for example, someone posted in my peer mentorship group a couple of months ago about a tough situation on a job interview, where the interviewer, where he did disclose at the very beginning, because that's a thing that we do. I encourage everybody to do that. But the job interviewer sort of seemed to not understand, and they sort of just moved on. And then they seemed to be confused about whether he was forgetting what he was saying. And someone, he posted that in the group, and someone else chimed in and said, well, what helps me is to just circle back and say again, just as a reminder, I have a stutter.
Mhm.
And just say those 4 words and pause and look them in the eye and let it sink in, like, oh yeah, I'm going to try that next time. And it's that sort of supporting each other and knowing that we know how each other feels,
Mhm.
right? And we know when somebody says that's worked for them, that they've been there, done that, rather than just sort of, well, let me give you some advice on, that sort of thing. It's a powerful
Yeah.
thing when you know that people have been there. And this applies to whether it's, say, Alcoholics Anonymous, right? From what I understand, Alcoholics Anonymous was really looked down on by the medical community at first.
Mhm.
None of them are experts in that room, just a bunch of drunks in there talking about their, problems. But as it turns out, you talk to alcoholics, and many of them will tell you, man, nothing helped me like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Just being with
Yeah.
other people that know the feeling, that know the struggle, that
Mhm.
and having mentors in the room who can say, totally know where you guys are, and this is how I made progress in my life. It's just so powerful, and it just makes you feel so not alone, and like you got friends, good friends that get it,
Mhm.
and that are, I think it's even better. I mean, I'm a huge fan of just support groups, period. But I think it can be even more useful if people are sort of rowing in the same direction, right?
Yeah.
We have a goal here to be courageous, confident communicators, and to stop, letting the stuttering wolf, so to speak, as I sometimes call it, dictate our life.
Yeah. Well, and like I know, and my personal experience, but it also reminds me of probably, an amalgam of all my clients that I've worked with over the years who did really well. And it basically can be encapsulated in the story of this client of mine who was just doing amazing. He hit his stuttering. His outcome of the clinical program he went through was that he actually was overtly stuttering a little bit. And he was essentially okay with it, but he was very fluent. He just felt this overwhelming freedom. It had been pretty long lasting for about 5 or 6 months. He was just on this high, and he was just super successful, and was just in all ways. He changed his major, which was something he was afraid to do. He did all of these things that were just wonderful for him. He went to his family reunion, and he was Italian, and it was this huge family reunion, and he asked everybody, and he finally found someone in his family tree who stuttered. It was just like he was just in all ways psychosocially and just in general doing great. He was approaching more situations with happiness. He was using the phone with freedom. He was just doing everything great. Then he got an internship out of town, and back then it was in the late 90s. We were still mostly communicating by phone. Like he and I would just call and talk, like back and forth, not really therapeutic, more of like just kind of, person to person, just chatting about stuttering and what he was going through. But, he went to this new city doing his first internship, and he was pretty freaked out. He was having a really hard time. He said, I'm just having a hard time. He goes, it's like, I'm afraid to talk. I'm stuttering a bit more, which I don't really care about, but it's happening more. I'm starting to hold back. And we just kind of talked it through. And at the end of one of our calls, he said, well, I think I'm doing better. I'll see you in the fall. I do want to come back to therapy one time a week. And we just redid a lot of the stuff. We were doing sort of the Sheehan, walking around campus, like introducing himself as a person who stutters, putting himself in situations. And he was just nailing all of them. It wasn't even a challenge. And he was kind of getting perplexed and frustrated. And like being supportive, like, you're doing great. How are you learning from this? How is this going for you? And at the end of one of our sessions, he says, I want to come back next week. I want to start going, because I read a small chapter of the NSA on campus. He said, I'm going to start going to that every month. He said, but I think I'm realizing that I'm just going to stutter. And that's all he said. And we said, yeah. And that's probably true. It's like, you're just going to stutter, but what about that? He goes, it doesn't mean I can't keep doing stuff. And it's like, yeah. And so even within him, who had made all these big changes in a very Sheehan approach therapy, within his mindset, there was still that inkling of, I still should be very fluent. And that's where he had started, but it had become very small. And he really got that because I think somewhat I was a person who stutters, and he could talk to me about it, and we connected. He was seeing all these models of other people, plus he had a group of clinicians in our clinic who were, the basic message was, it's okay to stutter, and you should actually try to stutter, because like that's a way forward, because a very Sheehan approach. And I see that with everybody, and I know that's how it was for me. And maybe we're coming like full circle as we talk, is that, for me, when I was doing a lot of fluency shaping early in college and my clinical experiences as a client, I would be doing great, and I would have these large improvements. And then by the time I went back after break, I was down, and it was always consistently down. I mean, it was like never, the gigantic 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It was 2 steps forward, 2.5 back, because I'd also feel really crappy about it, And finally, one semester, I came to that same conclusion. And I think most of my clients come to that same conclusion. It's like, yeah, you know what? I still stutter, but now what? And that's really the change. And I think groups and that ongoing support, is really kind of the key, I think, because we're still, even if you come off very fluent, and I think I'm an example of someone who a lot of times can come off very fluent. And I'm sure that like you get that a lot too, but the concept is when you come right down to it, you're still going to stutter, and that's okay. What do you do, and what are you going to do? And I think from there, there's potentially lots of things you're going to do that are going to help, and I think that's kind of what our role is as we help people, is how do you help them find their stuff, and what's going to work for them.
Right. And something I like to, remember myself and share with people, as people who stutter, we're supposed to stutter. It would be bizarre if we never did. So rather than beating ourselves up, and it's, I'm sure, probably we all still have it sometimes. You have a moment, you're like, God, I shouldn't have stuttered like that. But when you remember it, it's like, no, actually we are. That if we didn't, then we would lose the status as a person who stuttered. We wouldn't have this diagnosis anymore, And that idea, and I really like that sports mentality, right? You can't step on the basketball court and expect to make every shot. And if that's what you're planning on doing, and you're not going to be able to handle not making it, then just don't play, But obviously we can't not speak going through life. I guess we could go become guy in the wilderness in Alaska with no people if we really wanted, but so this accepting that, right, that this is going to happen, but not accepting that it means we have to be quiet, right? That it means we have to be quiet, and that we can't be ourselves as we go through this life, maybe not have the exact timing that we want to run that joke, but that comes with the territory, and Sheehan, as talked about this a good bit, where he said, buried deep inside of the heart of every stutterer, which is what he didn't call it person who stutters back in those days, is the belief that next Tuesday they're going to wake up and it's just, they're going to be a silver-tongued orator and it's all going to be in the past forever. But again, as he knew well, and we all know well, I think, that have sort of dove into this by accepting it, by saying, yep, I'm going to stutter. It's okay to stutter. I'm supposed to stutter. Maybe even it's cool that I stutter. I never got to the point of thinking that the stutter was ideal, but obviously I don't know if any of us would rather have a block if we can just spit the word out. But there is, as Chris Constantino has pointed out, there can be some gains from it, some stutter gains, some generating trust from people in some cases, because they see you got this thing that's challenging for you, but you're still out there, and you're saying, it has a facing stuttering blocks, and in particular, I'm a big fan of eye contact, looking people in the eye, and they can see that you're having a tough time a little bit getting your words out. They can see you have a speech impediment, but you're hanging in there, that you've got courage, that you're honest. You're showing your vulnerability. You're confident enough and honest enough to show your vulnerability. And, even if they don't consciously think that through, I think a lot of people sense it. But how we do it, right? Controlling the controllables, if you will. We might not be able to control when that word escapes our mouth, but we can control some things, like where we look, for example. And, again, with Chris, he said it took him years and years to realize that he would always look up and to the right when he was in a block. And finally he realized that, right? And, and as I like to say to people, we don't have an eye impediment. We have a speech impediment. So we can train ourselves as to where we're going to look when we stutter. My 4 kids just arrived back from school, so it's like
That's great.
the invasion of the children. But yeah, it's so powerful, I think, that control the controllables, right? And we can control whether we run away from this situation or we charge into it, right? We can control where we look. We can control whether we're tapping our limb. Not overnight, but we can work on these things, and we can control whether we habitually are trying to hide our stutter or whether we're facing that moment. You all know that moment. I'm about to struggle on this word. So, all right. For the benefit of the podcast listeners, I'm muting myself as I tell my kids to wait a few minutes. So that having that moment where we know we're about to have it, be shown, or it's going to be obvious that we're a person that stutters, right? And somebody's going to know it outside of us, who instinctually we'd rather not see us stutter, but here we are at the moment. And in my own mind, the way I came to think of it was, okay, Wilson, you got 2 choices right now. One is to be courageous, and one is to be cowardly. Which one's it going to be, right? And I'm not, using that word for other people that avoid it, because it's a process to get to that point. But for me, that made it clear in my mind. Okay, I'm at a junction point here, about to stutter in front of people. Which one's it going to be, Wilson? And I didn't want to think of myself as a coward. That makes my opinion of myself go down. But when I step forward and face it with courage, well, and I guess that's the point I got to. Don't evaluate yourself based on your fluency. Evaluate yourself based on your courage or cowardice. And once I sort of clarified that in my mind and had the action of somebody, it was Dr. Richard Ham at Florida State back in the mid-90s, who I think had worked, I think he knew Sheehan pretty well. They were a similar similar age cohort. And, that's what he did at Florida State, right? Like you were saying, just brought me out on campus and made me ask people questions and look them in the eye. So the action combined with the realization and the building new habits, right? So control the controllables. Would you say that's
Yeah.
a big mission?
Yeah, like that, like idea of what is it you want to do and what is it going to look like when you're doing it. That's usually a conversation I have with clients. And it's like, usually the first statement is, well, I'm doing it. It's like, okay, well, if your goal is to do phone calls on your own, what is it going to look like when you wake up next Tuesday, as you said, and you're doing phone calls? And it's like, they might say, well, it'll be easy. And it's like, well, is it going to be easy? Well, no, it won't really be easier, but it won't be easy, but like, it'll be a start. And it's like, good, that's probably fair, right? Is that you'll do it. It'll be a start in the right direction. You still might stutter, but you'll complete the phone call. And that's generally a pattern that people say. And it's like, okay, well, then that's it. You still have a choice not to do it, but the idea is when you're going to be doing it, here's what you'll do. And, a lot of folks get very detailed. Well, I'll make sure I know the phone number. I'll have part of a message prepared, because that's what most people do, even if they don't stutter, is they have a prepared message if they're calling for information, and then people need to have a good picture as to what it's going to look like when they're better. And I think sometimes when you don't have a good picture as to what it looks like when you're going to be better, your sense is that, well, I'm going to not stutter anymore. And then it'll be better and easy. And I don't think that that's really how things tend to happen with any new pattern of being. You sort of have to say, well, you know what, I'm going to have to just basically do it first. And then I'm going to have to go from there. Like I personally cowardly, and that doesn't work for me, but I get it. Like I usually say, it's like, all kinds of different ways this can go. And I think your step in the right direction is all that's required, Yeah. So Hollick, I think that's good stuff. I think that kind of is a good way to think about it, is that the step is that you're trying and that you're doing it and that you're trying to talk, you're trying to put yourself out there, and then you are putting yourself out there. And then if you can do things that allows you to communicate better along the way, then you know what, that's great, right? That's kind of the idea.
Right. And just realizing that if you step forward and speak and stutter, but finish, your thought, and, you order your cheeseburger or whatever you're ordering, rather than the hot dog that you were going to get just because you can say hot dog, not cheeseburger, that the result is that you get what you want. For example, in that case, right? You get the food you want, but also the result is you don't have to go to the hospital. You don't have to go, you don't go to jail. The earth doesn't go, hurtling out of its orbit into interstellar space. It's really not the end of the world. It's just a stutter. Nothing more, nothing less. And I think eventually, if we can get to that point where it's just like, yep, I got, brown hair, wear glasses, 45 years old, got a stutter, got 4 kids. It's just like one of the things about me, rather than, and it's ironic, right? It's paradoxical, as so many things are with stuttering, that not accepting the fact that we stutter often leads to a situation where stuttering dominates our existence. But when we accept it as just one of the qualities of myself, and I'm not saying, again, people have to, everybody's going to think it's beautiful or something like that, but it's sort of like a mole. All right, got a mole there. Not my favorite part of my topography, but there it is. And, I'm not going to let it dominate my life. And then stuttering sort of takes its rightful place. It's just one of our qualities. And I feel like, I had reached a point where I would forget, and this is even before I found the approach a few years ago that did help me more with the above the iceberg side of it. Totally not, cured by any means, but that it's, it's a lot easier for me to move forward now with my speech. But even those years from age 18 when I worked with Dr. Ham to age 41, when there was a lot more of a battle to get words out, I would still forget that I stuttered until the next time I talked, right? Like I wasn't sitting there working on my homework or watching the game or whatever, thinking, oh yeah, you stuttered when somebody knocks on the door, oh, that's going to be bad, or what phone, who might call me, or what do I have to do? Like I got, I would just forget. And then the next time I talk, I'd, have to battle through, oh yeah, stutter's still there. Okay. But that so by incorporating it, accepting it as a part of our identity, it can really push it down on the importance level, on our identity, our aspects of our identity that matter to us a lot,
Great. Yeah, no, a whole lot. Like I would tend to agree.
And so Rod, we're coming to the end of the time. Are there anything that that we didn't talk about that you'd like to touch on before we wrap it up?
No, like I think we covered a lot of ground. Yeah, like I can't think of any other specific message I think would go beyond on what we've already said.
And sort of one more question just popped in my head. So when I had Courtney Bird on, she's big, I think, as on trying to prevent the iceberg.
Really good friend of mine, yeah.
Nice. Trying to prevent the iceberg from ever forming in the first place in kids, right? So she told the story of a 4-year-old that they had worked with there at UT Austin, who, I don't know if she told me this story because I'm a dentist, but the 4-year-old went to a dental appointment and, the dentist walked in and asked her name, and the little girl stuttered on her name. And the dentist said, well, did you forget your name, sweetie? We've all heard that one. Not our favorite thing to hear, but rather than this little girl potentially being, like a deer in headlight, she's 4 years old. I mean, I didn't know how to deal with that when I was 18 or 17, much less 4. But she's been trained, she's worked with Courtney and them and is trained up on how to deal with that. So she said to the dentist, oh no, I just have a stutter, and sometimes it takes longer for words to come out. So just wait and the words will come out, right? Now, so, I think it's much less likely that little girl develops a deep iceberg in shame. She's probably not going to develop it like almost all the rest of us did, who got to, whatever age, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, whatever age, where we realized we were different. It was like, oh my God, really? I talk weird, and we're just like a total deer in headlights. I'm a big believer in that with young kids, because from what Courtney said, in her opinion, her reading of the literature, there's no evidence that by trying to, teach a 3 or 4-year-old that therapy for little kids is not actually increasing the percentage of them that will quote outgrow their stutter. So in terms of whether they're going to grow up and stutter, speech therapy when they're 3 or 4 or 5 there's very little evidence that that's going to change the trajectory of whether they outgrow it or not. So why not prevent, or do what you can to prevent all that deep, awful psychosocial pain from developing in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. Like I think that, like a lot of us would have similar stories of these kids doing these amazing things just because you give them the tools to talk about it. Well, one thing I would add is I think it's really important for parents and to work with parents to help them understand that, it's not our job to fix your child. They're not broken. They just speak a different way. And what we really have to do is let them know with everything we say and do that they're supported, that it's okay that they stutter, and that it's okay that they talk and that they speak up for themselves. And I remember this one mom I worked with, one of my favorite clients I had in my private practice. She was really bright. Her husband was a doctor, and was, had two young adult children as well. So this was sort of his second chance. And so he had two little boys who were like 5 and under, and then he had two little boys who were 16 and older. So for him, it's like, this is all going to be okay. She was like really freaked out because her oldest boy was really struggling with his speech. And this little kid was really smart. And all I did was I just really like hit him with, what do you think about all this? And like, he was like, oh yeah, well, like, it's fine that you stutter, Dr. Gabel. And I said, well, what about your stuttering? And he goes, oh, well, I guess it's okay too. And then we just really went on that road where all we did was talk about stuttering. And like, we practiced, some like easier stutters and that kind of stuff. But we started talking about, what happens when you go to school? What if someone says something and he goes, gosh, I don't know. And we just sort of problem solved it. And then we also did it with his mom, but his mom would come in and be like, the dental hygienist said something about his stuttering, or this little librarian said something. And I was like, did like he say anything? And she said, well, no. And I said, what do you think? And she says, well, I guess I don't know what to do. And so I talked to like her about what to do. And, said, I think it'd be pretty reasonable if you said, he stutters sometimes, please please be patient with him. He wants to get this out, and that would actually be empowering for him if she felt that would be helpful to her. But for him, like, we just developed a skill level that, like, he would say to people, I stutter and this is just how I am. And he said that all the time. I stutter and this is just how I am. And the only bullying experience he had was when these two older kids, and older kids can be jerks, it didn't take that as a like answer. And like I said, what's the like next step? And like, he goes, I don't know. And I said, do any other kids get picked on? And he said, yeah. And I said, what do they do? Well, we're told to go to an adult for help. And I said, then you should go to an adult for help, right? I said, that would make sense. They're not allowed to make fun of you when you stutter. And he goes, you know what, that's right. And I said, wouldn't you say that to a friend if that friend was getting picked on? And he said, yeah, I have a friend who gets picked on, and I tell the other kids in my class, it's not okay to pick on him. And I said, see, someone else should be able to do that for you. And so that idea of like, look, this is a normal variation that people don't know anything about. And usually why people behave bad is because they don't know what to do. And like, even if they do that, well, let's not talk to him because he stutters kind of garbage that people do, or let's not ask him to do that because he stutters. I mean, they do that because they're trying to be kind. They just don't know how to be kind. And so the more that we can empower kids to speak up for themselves, they'll, that'll become their habit pattern, instead of the habit pattern being, oh my God, I shouldn't talk or I should try to fight my stutter, or like I should avoid it. I mean, that's when we have problems. And so I think the earlier we can normalize and help families and their children normalize that this is a human experience that they need to deal with, and there's good ways to do it. It doesn't have to be an avoidance, fear, like negative thing. It can just be kind of what they do. And I think the earlier that can be gotten, the more likely the child will have a positive outcome. And I do wonder too, if that positive outcome might be that they don't really have to deal with, speech therapy or like negative impact for a good bit of their life, that they can always be moving forward and feeling positive and have good answers for their issues. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's now. Not to mention it can lessen those ultra painful childhood years, right?
Yep.
And because things obviously are easier. Well, adults are generally much cooler than middle school kids, at least nowadays. And if you're already skilled on how to talk about it, all that kind of stuff, it's such a huge leg up on the vast majority of people who stutter in human history. Most of us who just sort of stumbled into this whole experience feeling all alone, having no idea how the heck to deal with any of it. And get them together, all, like friends. I went to the Friends conference last July in Denver, a bunch of kids hanging out with each other. That's powerful too. And going back to earlier with Zoom, one thing I sort of would love to see at some point is a situation where, because you can do it pretty easily. So rather than the 7-year-old who stutters just being sent to the school speech therapist for 30 minutes a week, and she's a generalist obviously, or he, because they have to deal with whatever the speech conditions in the school are. Rather than that, have them maybe go to a separate room, but put them on a Zoom call with 20 other kids who stutter, from around the country, right? And with one adult mentor, whether it's a speech therapist or just a person that stutters, that's gone through the stuff themselves in life when it comes to stuttering, that sort of thing. I mean, that would be a way to get them some quality help, basically, for super low, without increasing cost at all, I think, because Zoom is virtually free,
Sure. Yeah. Those are the kinds of things that I think within that school context, when it's going well, that's the kind of things that are going on, is that people are going outside the context of that pull out half an hour one-on-one session. They're really getting, or they're using that 30 minutes to really give the child a good forum to sort of talk about stuttering and learn about stuttering and become more empowered, instead of just becoming a really good reader like I did. I got a lot out of my school stuttering therapy back in the 70s and 80s because I became a really good reader. Okay, now how often did I actually read out loud? Hardly ever in my life, but I became really good at it. It didn't mean that I was any more fluent or confident or successful in my speaking, or didn't feel very successful. But boy, I could read well. Well, in 25 minutes, that's what we had time to do if we used our time that way. So I think, but there are some good school therapists who take a not knowing stance and really do a lot with their time. They really figure out how they can be successful and find good ways to help the child. And then there are some who I think really do have a hard time being as productive and helpful as they could be.
I agree. Well, Rod, this has been fantastic.
Same here.
Thoroughly enjoyed the chat. And, as I've said before, one of the things I love about, putting this out there and podcast land is that it'll be around, and people can sort of get something out of it in terms of, realizing that they're not alone, and that this is, that there's so much room for improvement when it comes to quality of life, and that we don't have to live scared, and that stuttering does not have to destroy our life like we oftentimes thought that it would when we were younger. So thanks for joining us, and thanks for all the great things you're doing in the stuttering world.
Well, Ian, thank you. And if there's any way I can be involved in a future podcast, I am always available. It gets me out of the drudgery of academic administration. So thank you for the time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. Take care.